we have 400 participants registered for this event. It will be recorded, and given the interest that we have, we can see that this is only the beginning, and we hope to have other similar events in the future. So without further ado, let me hand over to a dear colleague and friend, Professor Ton Leifert from Leiden University, who will be moderating this first session. Thanks, Ton.
Thank you so much, Mia. Greetings to you all. Greetings from Leiden University. It's an absolute pleasure to serve as your moderator, at least for the first session, which is entirely devoted to the significance of Articles 7 and 8 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child for children in emergency settings. It is a real privilege to be the moderator of such an esteemed panel. But before we go into the details of this particular first session, I would like to hand over to Ms. Mikiko Otani, who is the current chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and she will welcome you. So Mikiko, thank you for joining us today, and I would like to give you the floor for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to thank the organizers to create this timely opportunity to discuss this very important topic, child rights to identity in emergency settings. Last month, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, together with the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against the Children, UNICEF, and United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, issued the joint statement to remind all states that children are full human rights holders and are entitled to special protection. We jointly called on states to recognize that all people under the age of 18 are children and have specific rights as guaranteed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and to uphold all the rights of all children everywhere at all times. This joint statement was made in the context of concerning global situations about children's rights. We said we are witnessing an increasing failure to uphold international humanitarian and human rights law obligations around the world, all against the backdrop of the significant challenges posed by pandemics, complex humanitarian emergencies, and extreme weather events, climate-related crises. Children and families continue to be displaced, while conflicts as well as states' efforts to counter armed groups, including those designated as terrorist groups by the United Nations, are further contributing to the erosion of international protection frameworks, often leading to the violation of children's rights. To be guaranteed special protection of children and recognized as human rights holders, children first need to be recognized as persons. Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 16 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provide the right of everyone to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Everyone, of course, includes children. And to be recognized as a person before the law, right to identity is key. The focus of today's symposium is children's right to identity in emergency settings, such as in armed conflict and migration, where children have increasing needs as well as challenges in accessing protection, services, and family reunification. For all this, the right to identity is so fundamental. I'm very much looking forward to the productive discussions, sharing good practices, and next steps to accelerate our collective efforts to address this very important issue for children. Thank you very much. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you so very much, Mikiko, for these opening words, underscoring the significance of today's meeting. And indeed, we will go into 3 different sessions this afternoon, addressing different issues related to the right, children's right to identity in emergency settings, armed conflict, etc. So thank you very much, Mikiko, for these encouraging and important opening words. In the first hour of this meeting, we are going to zoom in, as I mentioned just now, on the significance of Articles 7 and 8 of the Convention for children in emergency settings. And one of the focus points, for example, is on the children who are currently stuck and waiting for repatriation, or children that have been a part of such a process. And we have a number of speakers listed for you, and we are going to listen to them first, after which we will have the opportunity to go more into some details of their presentations, using some questions for them. And then we wrap up more or less around 3 o'clock, at least Central European time. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our first expert speaker. Her name is Gemma Deli, and she's a partner at Goodman Ray, a very well-known, significant family law firm, and Ms. Deli has been actively involved also in the repatriation of children to the UK, and on the basis of that significant experience, she will share some thoughts with you today. Ms. Deli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this symposium this afternoon. I'm very grateful to be able to share my experience with you on this very important subject. And I'm going to talk this afternoon about how the English courts are managing children's rights in the family cases, which are dealing with children who have been returned from Syria. But perhaps it is helpful first to look at the context and the number of those cases in the UK before we talk about some of the issues and challenges involved in those cases. The first British children to be returned to the UK were returned in 2019, following a family law case in the High Court, in which family members, having identified the location of the children, sought court orders for their return. Since that case, since 2019, only 10 British children in total have been repatriated to the UK from Syria. And unless there is a fundamental shift in the decisions about repatriation in the UK, for almost all returning children, their relationships with their birth parents will be severed forever. How the state deals with these cases, therefore, is fundamental to the protection of these children's identity rights, and a delicate balance must be struck between the risks to national security, the risks to the children themselves, and the best interests of the children concerned. In England, we have 2 types of cases before our courts. The 2019 case, which was a family-instigated repatriation, and all of the other cases, which have been repatriations following state-instigated actions. And I think it's perhaps helpful to look at some of the differences in the approaches in these 2 cases to consider what makes a successful repatriation. In the 2019 case, the family were involved in all of the decisions about the children's care and welfare from the outset. They had a voice through court proceedings, as did the children themselves, in all of the decisions that affected their identity rights, their family relationships, and as a direct result of that, these children were met at the airport by their extended family. They were returned to their family home where they continue to live, and they are thriving. And as a result of those decisions, these children were able to secure a strong sense of their family identity, having returned from difficult circumstances, and re-establish relationships with their family at the earliest opportunity. The risk to the children of publication of their circumstances and their identity is significant in any court proceedings. For these children, there was a real risk to their security when travelling from the camp to the UK, and this had to be very carefully managed through the court process by strict reporting restriction orders to ensure that no information could be shared in the press about them. These orders were extended on their return to the UK to preserve not only their identity, but the identity of the family members with whom they were placed. It goes without saying that any publicity about these children and their circumstances would result in risks to the success of their reintegration into their family, their community, their schools, and so on. The English courts are very alive to these issues in all cases involving children, and reporting restriction orders are now made as standard in all cases involving returning children. It was the early engagement by the family and with the family by all government agencies that ensured that they had access to multidisciplinary support, therapeutic support, practical support, not only for the children, but also for family members caring for the children and involved in the children's care and relationships through contact. This is essential for all family members dealing with children and caring for children who have been returned from war zones. Family need to understand the children's lived experiences, their unique needs, and how best to meet these needs. The state instigated cases are different, and we know that in these cases, birth parents and birth family are not always being identified at the earliest opportunity. So unlike the 2019 cases, it is not until much later in court proceedings that family members have a voice in the decisions to be made about their children. Where family members are known and are in contact with government agencies about the children, either before or after return, they are not being actively engaged until a court considers how they can best participate in any court proceedings. It is this lack of early engagement by the family members that leaves the responsibility for crucial decisions about children's placement and contact to government agencies. What we do know is often returning children have family members who want to be involved in their care. They want to support their children, but if they are not being engaged until months or sometimes years after a child's return, in this period, children may be placed with foster carers, pending the identification and engagement, which has a significant impact on children when they are returned to the UK, but also their future relationships. We know that family members have to be subjected to long and invasive assessments. This is necessary, of course, so that risks can be carefully weighed against the risks and the welfare of children concerned. But unless this can be done at the earliest stages, and ideally before a child's return, a child can experience multiple moves of carers, which undermines his or her long-term stability. We also know that in these state-instigated repatriations, contact with family members becomes even more important. So again, unless there is an early engagement with the family, consideration cannot be given to who those family members are, what benefit they can bring to a child, what benefit they can bring to ensuring these relationships are supported, and how those relationships can be supported safely. So what makes a successful repatriation, or perhaps reintegration being the better marker of success, is maybe too early to tell in the few cases that we have in the English courts. But in my view, we can learn a lot from the approaches of the two types of cases and how family members are involved from the start. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Gemma, for sharing these lessons learned from these two types of cases. It's extremely helpful and very relevant also in other jurisdictions. So thank you very much for sharing. I would like to hand over to our next speaker. And by the way, you can find more information on our speakers in the chat. And the second speaker of this particular session is Kirsten Di Martino, who is a senior child protection advisor at UNICEF. And she will more broadly focus on the impact of humanitarian contexts on the child's right to legal identity. And she will share some strategies on how to deal with those challenges in practice. So thank you very much, Kirsten, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me and UNICEF to speak at this very important symposium. So I would like to start by saying that in humanitarian contexts, of course, the child's right to establish, preserve, and re-establish an identity, including the right to be registered immediately at birth, to have a name from birth, to maintain their family relations, and to acquire nationality as enshrined in Article 7 and 8 of the Convention on the Rights, are all at heightened risk. One of the key factors is that often in humanitarian contexts, civil registration services are either weakened or overwhelmed. In almost all humanitarian contexts and protracted emergencies, including armed conflicts, natural disasters, mass cross-border or internal displacement, and public health emergencies, civil registration systems are often disrupted and in very extreme cases become completely dysfunctional or collapse entirely. The capacity of already under-resourced civil registrars is often weakened further, leading to a backlog of unregistered births, marriages, and deaths. Similarly, a sudden influx of refugees and the resulting increase in the number of births, as we have seen, for example, in Bangladesh and Pakistan, may also overwhelm existing civil registration services, rendering them unable to deal with the growth in the overall demand. And during armed conflicts, state institutions, including civil registrars, are increasingly being targeted and destroyed as a way of preventing the recording of future vital events and or to systematically destroy old records and archives. Large-scale epidemics and pandemics such as COVID-19 also severely disrupt the availability of civil registration services. Countries are still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has really reinforced the need to ensure that civil registration vital statistics systems are considered essential services and accessible to all without discrimination during public health emergencies. Adopting a one-stop approach and enhancing interoperability between civil registration systems with the health systems is proving to be a real game changer in this respect. For example, countries such as Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, and Namibia, where civil registration services were integrated at the points of service delivery in health facilities, they faced fewer disruptions and showed faster recovery from the COVID-19 impact. In crisis situations, families and children may also lose their identity, their birth, death, and marriage certificates. This can be unintentional or intentional. For example, the deliberate destruction of the vital records of the population by parties to a conflict, or the deliberate loss or destruction of documents by individuals out of fear of reprisals or to hide their true identity. Children who are separated from family members may also be unable to prove their identity. This can hinder their future family tracing and reunification. To prevent this, for instance, in Ukraine, the government authorities, together with UNICEF, called on those responsible for children living in residential care who had to be moved to safety to ensure that all children traveled with their documents, including birth certificates. In humanitarian contexts, access and fear may also hinder registration. Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, Nigeria, and Ethiopia are all examples of the difficulties people living in non-state controlled areas have to access civil registration services. Many are unwilling due to fear or cost, or unable to travel to state-controlled areas to register vital events. And state authorities often refuse to recognize documentation issued by the de facto authorities in areas controlled by armed groups. At times, it can also be dangerous for children not to obtain birth registration documents from an occupying power, even when this authority is not internationally recognized. To overcome these challenges, UNICEF has worked with authorities to implement approaches that are inclusive and preserve multiple nationalities, or extend nationality recognition to children who are living in occupied areas. Special consideration needs to be taken to ensure the safety of children and their families in accessing these services, and a range of e-tools have been adopted that make this increasingly possible. Children whose parents are perceived to be associated with armed groups are also at risk of being denied an identity and becoming statelessness. We have all seen in the media examples of citizenship stripping for individuals who are believed to have been associated with such armed groups without due process. This results not only in the statelessness of the individual, but also of the children. In addition, children of foreign-born parents who were born in places under the control of armed groups face particular challenges in establishing their identity and nationalities. Similarly, migrants and displaced populations are often unable to access civil registration services owing to lack of physical access to procedures or financial barriers or laws or policies that explicitly exclude them from registration, and especially when there is cross-border migration. UNICEF proposes 4 key strategies to ensure children can establish, preserve, and re-establish their identity if it is lost. First, there should be a strong enabling environment. We need to have policies and laws that provide for registration and certification free of charge, waiver fees and fines for late and delayed registration, and or extension of registration deadlines during and in the aftermath of emergencies without discrimination. Second, we have to have institutional arrangements in place to guarantee continued services delivery in humanitarian contexts. The delegation of registration authority to health staff is crucial to ensure continued birth and death registration, as health services are classed as essential services. Similarly, national humanitarian coordination mechanisms should ensure the continuity and inclusiveness of registration services. Thirdly, we need to ensure safe and secure storage, including online and or electronic backup systems, so that registers can be reconstituted as necessary. Clear standards and procedures should also be in place to reconstitute lost, damaged, or destroyed civil registers. And fourth, we need to strengthen humanitarian mechanisms and coordination and integrate civil registration in national disaster preparedness and response mechanisms and plans. Central to all these efforts is the availability, accessibility, and affordability of civil registration services, including in emergency and humanitarian situations. The more developed civil registration systems are in non-humanitarian contexts, the more resilient and prepared they will be to withstand humanitarian situations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for sharing these strategies, very clear. And thank you for elaborating on this. I would like to proceed, for the sake of time, immediately to our third panelist, and her name is Elsie Jellema. She's a senior child protection officer at UNHCR, and her presentation will focus on the application of Article 7 and 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child as part of the Syria response, and she will show how essential these provisions and this focus on these provisions were. Els, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here today. In the interest of time, I'll jump immediately into this presentation. As mentioned by the other panel members, having a legal identity is both a human right and a foundation for protection. The Convention of the Rights of the Child also enshrines the principle that every child has the right to an identity, including a name, a nationality, and family relations, which can be at risk in emergency settings and a humanitarian crisis, as also emphasized by my UNICEF colleague earlier. So as such, the situation of children affected by conflict, displacement, and family separation remains very concerning globally, but also in the region. Now, the application of Article 7 and 8 of the CRC have been really essential in the Syria response. With half of Syria's physical registries destroyed or no longer functioning in many areas, many of those affected by the conflict were left with no means to replace their vital documentation. And as you can imagine, those without identity documents can find it difficult or even impossible to register divorces, deaths, marriages, and births, both in Syria, but also in host countries. All of which can make it impossible for a child to prove his parentage or basically even the country to which it belongs. Also, the destruction of hospitals in conflict areas has left many women to give birth in very dire conditions, very often without access to the medical birth notification that is required by law to obtain a birth certificate. Now, specifically those displaced from Syria, they have faced similar problems in host countries, even if they fled the immediate dangers of conflict. Although these people find protection from the hazards of war, refugees often continue to face difficulties in registering new births and marriages in countries of asylum. They're often unfamiliar with, for example, the new laws and procedures. They're very often consumed with the immediate demands of coping and surviving. Many, as UNICEF colleague also mentioned, have lost or have since expired documents. The other element that's important to mention is that Syrian children acquire nationality through their fathers, but 25% of Syrian refugee homes have no fathers to attest to a child's nationality because of family separation in this context. In case where newborn children lack evidence of paternity, the risk of statelessness emerges, as mothers do not basically confer nationality. And as you all know, the consequences can be lifelong and also passed on to the next generation. But at the same time, it creates a range of child protection risks, such as child labor and child marriage. So in such situations, a birth certificate is really critical to preventing statelessness by providing evidence of the child's parentage and place of birth, which are the primary means by which children acquire a nationality at birth. Now, to talk a little bit about the progress and what was done. So progress is especially notable for Syrian refugee children in the steps that refugee hosting countries in the MENA region are taking to document and register every child born on their territory to really ensure that every child begins life with a birth certificate and a legal identity. So in the 3RP context, as part of the Syria response, UNHCR, governments and partners very much continue to increase access to civil status documentation and preventing statelessness. If we look back, this significantly reduced the percentage of Syrian refugee children born in the region each year without any form of identity documents. So I'm talking here about birth certificates, but also medical birth notifications. From approximately 35% in 2012 at the beginning of the crisis to only 4% in 2021. So there's been a stark decrease, and that progress continues to happen as we speak. Now, how was this done? First of all, there was a lot of engagement with communities, which really helped to make people aware of the need to register vital events. Second of all, there was a lot of partnership with governments to simplify procedures and find solutions for obtaining documentation. This included by, for example, improving access to marriage registration, which, as you may know, is a legal prerequisite for birth registration in most of the countries in the region. It also included increasing women's access to civil status documentation, as well as civil registries in camps, for example. A third element of the response was special procedures to resolve late birth registration, as well as dedicated support to difficult cases. And a final element was legal aid and counseling. I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Els, for sharing these insights and these lessons learned also from your organization, and underscoring birth registration and its significance is absolutely important also in this particular session. So thank you very much for that. I would like to hand over to our fourth panelist, Benyam David Mesmour, who is a current member, but also former chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and he does more, of course. And you can check his bio in the chat. Benyam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ton. It's a pleasure to be here. If I had much less time, I would probably have said, please go back to the comments, important comments that were made by our chairperson, Madam Kiko Otani. But in any case, I want to use my time and build a little bit further. I am tempted to take the conversation one step back before emergencies actually happen. We often say that disasters are the greatest equalizers because they strike everybody in an equal manner. That's not true, that's false. And most of the pre-emergency measures often help you weather emergencies better. We've seen it state party after state party that has actually come before the Committee on the Rights of the Child, where the institutional framework was solid, where the data collection was solid, where the training was undertaken and the information management was up to standard. The possibility of weathering these emergencies that do compromise children's rights, including their right to identity, is much better than the instances that the pre-emergency situation was not good. So the acknowledgement of the application of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the optional protocols, both in times of calm, but also in emergencies, in times of peace, but also conflict. That's absolutely critical. It might sound as an obvious thing, but it's not. We've seen it in the context of the migration crisis, 2015, 2016, 17. We're currently seeing it in the context of the war on terror in relation to the children that are in Syria and so forth. Quite a number of countries that have been championing, have been sponsoring resolutions and hosting events and so forth. When these situations actually happen, they seem to backtrack, including on issues that actually compromise children's identity rights. Now, let me zoom in on three elements. One is age determination, which is obviously linked to birth registrations. Quite a number of the recommendations that we give to a number of states have relevance for age determination. Age determination is pretty much critical to the convention because it's applicable on the basis of age. So if you take as a state party best interest seriously, if you take individualized assessment seriously, you would also take age determination seriously, the requirement to provide birth registrations, not just only to register, but also to issue birth certificates, which become very critical in the context of emergencies. You also will place emphasis on the issue of information management systems and data collection as critical tools to address a whole range of rights that children have under the convention, but also their identity rights. And a critical tool that we often recommend to states is, when in doubt about the age of a young person, please assume on the side of saying that this young person is a child and accord the different rights that are required instead of assuming that this child is an adult. Now, the second point that I just want to flag is adoption in times of emergencies is a very important issue. In fact, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, when we issued our previous general comment number, the previous general comment on children's rights in the context of migration, we had already said that adoptions are not recommended during emergencies, particularly intercountry adoptions, and it's important to allow at least around 2 years to lapse before you proceed with adoptions. And that, I think, is still proving its relevance, whether it's in the context of Ukraine, whether it's in the context of Ethiopia, whether it's in the context of a whole range of other emergencies we're currently dealing with. And that's an absolutely important rule that needs to be upheld to make sure that children's right to identity is guaranteed in the context of emergencies. The third point that I just want to flag is obviously a point that has already been highlighted: anti-terrorism laws and nationality. The only thing that I want to say here is that we have had a number of countries that actually come to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and one more recent one is the one that we gave to the government of the Netherlands, where we said the state party should ensure that no child, including those between 16 and 17 years of age, is deprived of his or her nationality for actions that are considered to constitute a threat to national security, and also consider children's best interests when such withdrawals of nationality are imposed on parents. When we have that information provided to us as a committee, this is a recommendation that we would definitely be keen. One of the recommendations we would be keen, which we do believe it will uphold a whole range of children's rights, not just only violence and deprivation of liberty and so forth, but also including on the right to identity. A final point that I would mention is the role that the optional protocol on a communications procedure is playing is absolutely important and critical. We're happy to see the ratification numbers grow. If one goes and looks at the jurisprudence that is emanating, there are quite a number of elements that are giving an indication that the right to identity is one of the central elements that is being addressed through that process, including the notion that says, if you are actually considering someone who's a child not to be a child, if you're changing their date of birth and so forth, that actually affects their identity. I leave it at that in the interest of time, and thank you very much, Ton. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Benyam, for sharing these thoughts. Very insightful, very important, I think, to work on also when you're still in times of peace. Thank you so much. I would like to invite all the panelists to come back and put on your cameras, because we would like to go back to you now with some specific questions, and then I hope we can have a discussion among ourselves. And this particular part of this first session focused on Article 7 and 8 in emergency settings is now led by Benjam again. So Benjam, I would like to give you back the floor after you had a few seconds to digest all the presentations all together, and you can ask questions to the different panelists.
Thank you very much, Ton. Much appreciated. I have had the opportunity to also have advanced access to some of these presentations. So I'm just going to start with Gemma. The first question is, what are your thoughts on how to overcome the main obstacles that threaten the enjoyment of identity rights for children born in Syria to nationals of Western countries who are seen as being associated with ISIS? So over to you. You're on mute.
Yeah, you're muted. Yes.
Apologies, thank you. In terms of the obstacles, looking at it from a family law perspective, which is what my presentation is about, in addition to the problems that we've seen through the cases about early engagement of family members, I think other obstacles that threaten enjoyment of identity rights in these cases are a lack of understanding by family members of the actions of their family member who is associated with ISIS, and also a lack of understanding about the risks that they might pose, not only to national security, but also to any returning children who can be cared for safely within the family. And in my view, in order to mitigate those risks and to promote the safe family relationships, there should be a specialist professionals who work with the family as soon as they're identified to help them to understand those risks. A better understanding of the issues ensures that families can be safely involved in the care and support of returning children. And any risks that are identified which stop those contacts or those safe care arrangements happening can be reduced with information, support and work and managed more effectively. There should be early consideration of what information can be safely disclosed to family members so they have a better understanding of the issues that the professionals are looking at when they're looking at meeting the needs of children and ensuring the safety of children. It would also be helpful to think about what measures can be put in place at the earliest opportunity to safeguard a child, but while promoting the identity of the child and any family relationships. We have to accept that risks have to be assessed. That's a very important part of the process. But what I think that courts should be looking at is specialised life story work, perhaps while those risks are still being assessed, so that there can be an introduction of family members through photographs or video messages, through the exchange of letters or gifts, working towards supervised contact so far as risks are able to be managed, to ensure that the child can build relationships with key family members, but also to ensure the safety of the child. That is a process that needs to be followed, but only through that process can children properly enjoy their identity rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma, for also the comprehensive look, not just only focusing on 7 and 8 as being the anchor, yes, but a whole range of other rights that become also very critical to the realization of children's rights, in this particular case, their right to identity. Kirsten, regarding, you laid out very interesting and useful strategies. So regarding the strategies you laid out to protect children's identities rights in emergencies, what are the potential challenges to implementation, and how can they be best addressed or at least mitigated against? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Benjamin. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, it's not only what happens during the humanitarian situation, but it's actually what happens before, which is also extremely important. It's the prevention part and the preparedness part that is really critical. I think one of the biggest challenges is really actually establishing one uniform civil registration system, which is accessible and affordable to all children and families. the key is really to embed registration services with routine health services wherever that is possible, to ensure also in humanitarian context that there can be continuity of registration, and to have also the necessary community-based registration machinery to respond to other crises. For example, registration can also take place at the village, ward offices, or it can also be facilitated by frontline workers, whoever they may be within a certain context, such as midwives, who can do notifications and declarations of birth, even though they may not be able to do registration, but these documents are still proof of birth and can be then used later on also to register, to do delayed registration if needed. So this really requires building a very resilient and I would say agile system, which is really anchored in a safe, and I say safe, and appropriate and innovative digital framework, and which is really backed by sufficient and sustained financial and human resources during non-humanitarian situations. So the preparedness part of it. So we always have to remember that the cost of investing is always less than the cost of inaction ultimately, right? And as I said before, the more developed civil registration systems are in non-humanitarian contexts, the more resilient and prepared they will be to withstand any humanitarian situations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Also for underscoring the cost element. And I hope that there are some people in this call that are representing states, working for states, but also hopefully they will have access to it at a later stage, because some of those experiences are definitely very useful. Let me come to the third question that I have, which is for Els. With regard to any persistent gaps you can identify affecting the identity rights of children in the Syrian context again, what role should international agencies, states, and civil society play in addressing those gaps? Over to you.
Thank you very much for that important question. I would like to start maybe by just emphasizing the important role that is played by states, since ultimately they have both the ability and responsibility to address these issues. With, of course, UNHCR and other partners playing a very much supporting role to that effort. Now, based also on the presentation I gave earlier, and really partnerships have been very key in reducing the risks of statelessness in the Syrian context. And I think that continues to be a key in addressing also the persistent gaps, both at the country level, but also supported at the regional and global levels. Another element that I think is important to maintain communication with communities and ongoing data collection, which is a point you also mentioned earlier yourself, because it's really essential to keep this up-to-date data that is really based on the latest developments, and to really make sure that we know what the latest particular challenges are that are faced by affected communities. And really to ensure that the responses meet the needs of those communities. Now, another element would be the contribution to solutions through suggesting innovative approaches and technical support by UN agencies and other partners is an important element that would remain important going forward, while also, continue to look at whole society approaches and really trying to engage everyone in these responses. Also, finally, sort of the engagement at regional level in taking forward recommendations of the 2018 League of Arab States Declaration on Belonging and Legal Identity, I think is an important element to keep in mind. And then at the global level, sort of working on the prevention and reduction of statelessness, including through the Global Action Plan to End Statelessness, which run from 2014 to 2024, and then the Global Alliance that is currently in the making, which will take those efforts forward beyond 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's very, very much appreciated, and they're also theoretically solid, but also practically significant as well. I hand over to the moderator, Tom. Over to you.
Thank you, Benyam, for raising these questions. Thank you all the panelists for answering. And I have the pleasure of closing this particular part of this afternoon by asking you one final question. And this is really the opportunity to give us some final messages and some final takeaways. And if I had to ask everyone the following question, what would be your reply? And I would like to ask you to be brief and focused, but this is the opportunity to give this core message. So can anyone, each of you, can you speak of a very recent positive development that you would like to share, and which is a basis for what is, in your view, what states or the international community or civil society or all together can do to ensure that such a positive development can actually continue to progress? So one positive development that you would like to share that is serving as either an example or a hopeful sign that we can build on, and what would be then the obvious next step? So Gemma, if I can start with you.
Thank you. For us, because there are so few cases that we see going through our courts, each case that takes place has a small incremental positive development. And what would be good to see would be some uniform approach to how these cases can be dealt with, if that is possible, obviously balanced against national security. But I think as each case goes through the court process, what we see is the real importance of specialist resources, specialist professionals who have an understanding of the really very unique and important issues involved in these cases, and the unique set of circumstances that these children have to face for their future. So I would like to see more specialist resources. We have developed in our court system what we call open and closed proceedings. And those are proceedings that are open to family members and other parts of proceedings that are closed to family members, but family members here would have an advocate, a special advocate involved in the closed proceedings, which ensures that not only do they have their voice heard, but they have an opportunity to present their case in a human rights compliance way. And so that is a very important step in how family members can be promoted and their voice can be heard within these proceedings to ensure the identity rights and family relationships with these children that are very important to them can be preserved.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Very clear and well noted. Kirsten.
Yes, thank you. I think what we are seeing and witnessing from our efforts at country level is really the one-stop approach and the interoperability and twinning between civil registration systems and other sectors, whether it's social protection, education, and so forth. But the one key game changer, the one strategy that seems to be most impactful at country level is really interoperability between civil registration systems and health and immunization system to ensure really that children have legal identity and are registered immediately after birth. This also really lays a very solid foundation for what we call the health, civil registration, national identity pathway, which ensures that you really can collect information once and use it multiple times, and also that you move information and not people. And this really requires states to adopt a holistic approach to civil registration, vital statistics, and identity management, which is a full life cycle approach from birth to death, and as is recommended also by the UN Legal Identity Agenda. And then coupling all of this with simplified business processes and digitalization as an enabler, not as the only factor, but as a tool to enable these efforts, will provide really the much needed boost for ensuring that all children can have a legal identity from birth and can preserve that identity. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kirsten, for that comprehensive final answer. Really insightful. Els, what is your final message?
Thank you very much, Ton. I think from our side, I mean, in the presentation, I've already gone over a lot of the positive developments that we have seen in response to issues of birth registration in the Syria conflict. And I mean, this is a process that has started in 2012 and has continued over the years. And in different countries, we see different initiatives coming up, which I've sort of grouped together a little bit in my presentation. But I think the issue, what we've seen and what would be great if it continues, is really the understanding by governments in particular, but others as well, of the fact that you know, Syrian refugees or refugees in general just don't have all the legal requirements and documents that are needed sometimes to issue a birth certificate. And I think with that understanding, they've shown a great deal of flexibility in their procedures. Sometimes they've completely waived any requirement to provide official documentation, or they've relied on UNHCR refugee cards, or even witness statements from communities. In other cases, they've just made the procedures a bit more accessible, either just by, for example, waiving the fees for late birth registration, which are often difficult to pay by refugees. But also just in terms of access, it's sometimes difficult for refugees to access those services because it involves traveling or, again, paying for transportation. So what we've seen across the region has been a lot of governments making civil registration services available through mobile clinics, which has been very effective. So I think there's been a lot of good practices in there, and I think it continues to be important, as I said, to really continue to be pragmatic and innovative, and to take a flexible approach, and in the end, really keeping in mind that we have probably prevented statelessness for hundreds and thousands a large number of children. And I think with that as well, to always keep in mind, or to try and put yourselves in the shoes of children who don't have a legal identity, and what it means on their day-to-day lives. I think that's an important element to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's indeed true, Els. Thank you very much for sharing. Benjam, the floor is yours for your final message, and then we break.
Thank you very much, Ton. I would like to revert back to the potential and important role that the optional protocol on a communications procedure is showing. We've always known, as members of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, as child rights activists, academicians, and so forth, that the optional protocol was going to hold significant potential. But what we are actually experiencing is that it's also making us think deep and hard. It's helping us to think through things in relation to the specific rights, what their implications in complex situations is. If you go and look at the jurisprudence that already exists, whether it's on age determination or family reunification, or the contents of birth certificates, the role of consular services, cases involving deportation, exceptionally, and I use the word exceptionally advisedly, exceptionally, the cases involving Hague Conventions, both on the adoption, but also child abduction, Dublin regulations, institutionalization of children without one of the parents knowing, and so forth, so forth. I can go on and on. Quite a number of the cases have significant implications to Articles 7 and 8. So what am I driving at? I'm driving the point that the optional protocol is helping us to interpret the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in a very meaningful way. It's also helping us to look at not just only children's rights as human rights, but also to help us look at other international law, refugee law, and so forth, so forth. But it's also helping us to make the connection, not just only in terms of human rights, but also development issues, emergencies issues, and so forth. So ultimately, what I would say is it's delivering what it had promised, maybe even beyond. We don't choose our cases, the cases choose us, but we, of course, promote the ratification of the optional protocol. We, of course, want civil society organizations to engage, for instance, in the submission of third-party interventions, and so forth, so forth. So that's going to be my final remark. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much for that powerful remark. And with that, I would like to close this first session. Thank you very much indeed to all the panel members. And Mia, I hand back to you.
Thanks, Ton, and thank you to the panelists. Extremely interesting and very valuable contribution to this webinar and for protecting and preserving children's rights to identity. We will now have a break, a little intermission of 5 minutes. We wanted a bit longer, but it's okay. What we've got is something a little bit special. Have a break. Everybody can have a break, but for those that don't need a break, we have a the voice of children that have from Ukraine during the war, who have expressed what they're feeling through their drawings and how it is affecting their identities. This exhibition is supported by the Permanent Mission of Ukraine in Geneva and has been part of the project of Mama I See War and supported by the Association of the Committee in Ukraine in the Canton de Vaud in Switzerland. So we'll put that on and then we'll start again at 3 o'clock or 3:02. Okay, 2:02. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the second session of this symposium on the child's right to identity in emergency settings. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start the presentations. There is for those who are just joining now that are new, there is interpretation. You'll see the interpretation button at the bottom of your screens. It is in French, English, Spanish, and it says German, but German is Arabic. To benefit from the privilege of having such exclusive and high caliber presenters today, we have chosen to focus on their presentations, which means that the bios will be put in the chat function. It also means that we won't have a public question and answer time. I see that there are questions in the question and answer function. We will respond to those that we can during the meeting, but if not, we will give due consideration and try to respond to those after the meeting. Also, that you know that there have been a significant number of people that have registered for this event today, and given the interest, we hope that this is only the beginning of meetings that we will have on these topics. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the moderator of the day, Denisha Moss from the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. Thanks, Denisha.
Thank you, Mia. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Denisha Moss, and I lead the children's program at the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And I am pleased to moderate today's second session on children's identity rights in emergencies, focusing specifically on the context of armed conflict. The right to identity, including nationality, is protected under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and forms an integral part of ensuring that children are able to enjoy other rights guaranteed under the Convention. So where identity and nationality are compromised, children face an undeniable risk of some of the most heinous violations, including the 6th grade violations committed against children in armed conflict. I am joined today by an esteemed panel of 5 speakers, all from different backgrounds, who will focus on the importance of protecting children's identity rights, specifically in the context of armed conflict. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Dragica Megavitsa, who represents the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children Affected by Armed Conflict, and she will be speaking about the 6th grade violations children affected by armed conflict face, how those risks are exacerbated for children lacking identity documents and nationality, and how the mandate is addressing these concerns. And so I would like to hand over to you, Dragica.
Thank you so much, Denisha, and thanks to ISI and Child Identity Protection for inviting me to represent my office to this symposium. A special thanks to you for bringing in children's voices. I, as a child who grew up in war in Bosnia, these drawings were really resonant and really poignant. So thank you for that. Like you alluded in your introduction to me, our mandate of the Office of the Special Representative to the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, it's a mouthful, derives from the UN General Assembly and 13 Security Council resolutions that has existed for 25 years now and is framed around monitoring and reporting around these 6th grade violations. And they include recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming, rape and other forms of sexual violence, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. And just for 2021 period, as reported in the Secretary General's annual report we published in July this year, we verified almost 24,000 violations across these 6. And cross-referencing the list of countries in preparation for this that have existing gender discrimination, for instance, in nationality laws, which prevents women from equally conferring nationality to their children, mentioned by previous speakers in the first panel, against the 25 situations that we cover right now. There are 6 overlapping on our agenda, and these are Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Nepal used to be on our agenda. So it was an interesting bit of research on my part. But we know that in conflict contexts, families may be separated, as we've heard, civil documents lost and family members killed, maybe killed or detained. Displaced children may be unable to provide a legal link to their father, and therefore unable to acquire their father's nationality. When women are denied their equal right to pass nationality, children who are in or displaced from conflict contexts are at an even greater risk of statelessness. And when the state maintains discretion regarding the conferral of nationality to children of female citizens, this is one of the points that resonated with me from previous colleagues speaking in session 1. The state may reject nationality applications due to child's assumed link to certain ethnic or religious racial groups, including communities that are linked to armed groups. So what I thought would be interesting today would be to just look through the lens of these 6 grave violations and how it relates to children's identity and the issue of statelessness. Really, the statelessness and discriminatory nationality laws compound children's vulnerabilities and increase their exposure to these violations. So just to give you a few examples, starting with the recruitment and use of children for military purposes, those children that are stateless or without identity documents or birth registration to prove that they are below 18 years of age are more easily recruited into armed groups and armed forces. And once released from these groups, often through dialogue with parties to conflict from the UN side, they lack identification that would further complicate their access to reintegration and rehabilitation services that they so rightfully need and deserve, which then also subjects them to the risk of re-recruitment. And recruitment and use continues to be one of the highest of these violations that we monitor year in and year out. Looking at stateless children's inability to move within or outside of country due to their lack of identity documents, they may be trapped in active areas of conflict, so exposed to risk of shelling and discriminate attacks, and therefore killing and maiming, also one of our highest verified violations. And then when we're looking at the impact, obviously, with regards to exposure of women and girls who lack legal identity to sexual and gender-based violence, crimes, and trafficking, this is another manifestation for us of how statelessness increases those vulnerabilities. And then one final point, in thinking through the lens of the grave violations in the course of emerging counterterrorism efforts, for us, we see that women and children, and this was also mentioned earlier, with links to UN designated terrorist groups may be rendered stateless, with countries that are increasingly resorting to stripping their citizenship of those who are affiliated or alleged to be affiliated with terrorist groups, which makes them vulnerable to other violations of their human rights. And our mandate focuses on ending these violations, but monitoring prevention of violations and provision of these reintegration services that I mentioned for conflict-affected children is virtually impossible without a child's recorded identity. So the impact is tremendous, not least to say at the cost of our joint vision for achieving the SDGs by 2030. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Back to you, Denisha.
Thank you so much, Jalatica, for expounding on how children without identity documents and stateless children are at an increased risk of suffering these grave violations, especially recruitment and the denial of humanitarian assistance, and even re-recruitment, which are amongst the most grave violations that your office is seeking to prevent. I would now like to invite our second and third speakers for this session, who will be co-presenting on their experiences in the context of the Colombian conflict. Mr. Furley Vargas, who will share his story of successful reintegration into society following his experience as a child soldier. And his presentation will be immediately followed by Ms. Stella Duke, who is the executive director of an organization called Tala de Vida. And her organization facilitates rehabilitation and reintegration of those affected by armed conflict through youth activism and art. Over to you, Furley. And can you both please make sure that you have your language switched to Spanish at the bottom of the screen? Thank you.
Gracias. No te escuchamos, Ferley. Ferley está tratando de comunicarse, de hablar, pero no sé qué dificultad tiene con el audio. Ferley es un joven que hizo parte de los procesos de taller de vida hace algunos años y hoy es un joven que se dedica a la realización audiovisual. Esperemos que logre compartir. No sé si me están escuchando a mí y puedo continuar mientras Ferley resuelve el problema del audio. ¿Está bien?
Perfect. Thank you, Stella.
Muy bien, me gustaría contarles que somos el Centro de Desarrollo Psicosocial, una organización que de hace más de 30 años trabaja en Colombia en el marco del conflicto armado que hemos vivido como país por más de 60 años. En el marco de este conflicto, el enfrentar la vulneración de los derechos de niños y niñas que no tienen una identidad y que son reclutados por los grupos armados ilegales en Colombia y llevados a ser niños soldados y a usar el arma ha sido uno de nuestros principales trabajos. Ahí conocí a Ferley y pudo ser parte de nuestros procesos. Nos gustaría decir que esta es una de las situaciones de mayor vulnerabilidad de derechos de niñas y de niños, ya que por una parte no hay identidad, hay una desvinculación total de la familia, pero también hay una exclusión de la sociedad civil y la posibilidad de participar y contar con una identidad. Eso es lo que enfrentamos cuando un niño es llevado al conflicto armado en Colombia. En Colombia sigue siendo un fenómeno alarmante, a pesar de que avanzamos hacia unos acuerdos de paz que se han dificultado en el país. Estamos en un proceso de construir un proceso de paz y una negociación con los grupos guerrilleros. Se logró concertar una negociación con la guerrilla de la FARC y ahora intentamos, se acaba de empezar el día de ayer una negociación con otro grupo guerrillero que es el ELN, pero esto no es suficiente, porque además hay bandas criminales unidas al narcotráfico que aprovechan los niños de comunidades indígenas y afrodescendientes que no tienen documentos, que no tienen identidad para ser usados en el conflicto armado. Esto lleva a que el niño o la niña no exista como ser humano, no exista como persona y sea utilizado como un objeto. Cuando logran salir porque huyen, porque escapan o porque son recuperados en algún acuerdo, hay que empezar un proceso de inclusión a una sociedad civil después de haber sufrido vulneraciones muy graves y profundas en sus cuerpos, como violencia sexual, mutilación de sus cuerpos, ser sometidos a trabajos forzados, estrés extremos, miedo y todas estas situaciones. En el proceso de inclusión a la sociedad civil es preciso enfocarse en la restitución de derechos, empezando por ser parte de una sociedad civil que no se comprende ni se entiende cómo funciona, cómo existe y cómo ser parte y participar. Por otra parte, en muchos de los casos es empezar el proceso de educación porque es analfabeto, o sea, nunca se tuvo acceso a la escuela. En vez de un lápiz, un cuaderno y la posibilidad de estudiar, lo que tuvieron en las manos fue un arma. La otra parte está en la salud, porque hay enfermedades como leishmaniasis y otras que se adquieren en la selva, con las cuales se llega después de este proceso. Entonces, proceso de reintegración implica la participación distancia, ¿no? Responsables de la atención en la infancia en Colombia, como el Instituto Colombiano de Bienestar Familiar, organizaciones de la sociedad civil como nosotros, y también acciones de organismos internacionales como Naciones Unidas, que deben hacer permanentes llamados al gobierno de Colombia para lograr garantizar que se escuche y que se logre, que se reintegren a niños y niñas que han estado en el marco del conflicto armado. Entonces es un proceso bastante complejo y hay que sensibilizar a la sociedad civil para que entienda la exigencia que tiene. Es muy fácil llevar a un niño a la guerra, pero es muy difícil sacar la guerra, las vivencias del cuerpo de ese niño o esa niña que retorna a la sociedad civil. Y retornar a la sociedad civil implica, por una parte, justicia, tener que abordar todos los temas de justicia. Por otra parte, la parte de ser un ser humano legal, que tiene una ciudadanía, que hace parte de un país y que lo vaya comprendiendo. Y por la otra parte, educar y formar. Esto implica todo un proceso de acompañamiento psicosocial, que es el que nosotros realizamos. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? Dando la voz a niños y niñas desde estrategias unidas a las artes expresivas, a la arteterapia y a procesos de abordaje terapéutico desde un enfoque sistémico, usando metodologías como photovoice, como narrativas digitales, como expresiones desde el arte, desde el movimiento, para ir logrando ganar en esa comprensión de sentido y de participación en un nuevo contexto y una nueva sociedad. Lograr que los niños y niñas salgan del conflicto armado es un gran reto que nos debe comprometer como organizaciones y países. Muchas gracias. Le doy la palabra a Ferley para que él pueda compartir su experiencia. Hola, Ferley, te seguimos sin escuchar, no sé qué pasó.
We don't. Ferley, we don't have audio at the moment for you. Okay, I think maybe Ferley will rejoin the panel, but perhaps we should move
Sí,
on.
Ferley está en el sur de Colombia, en una zona bastante apartada, que es el Caquetá, y en Colombia hemos tenido unos días de mucha lluvia, y tal vez eso está dificultando la conectividad de internet. Mil disculpas.
¿Sí me escuchan? ¿Aló?
Sí, ya te escuchamos.
Bueno.
Yes,
Buen
we
día
can hear
para
you now.
todos.
Wonderful.
Buen día para todos. Agradezco mucho la oportunidad que me brindan para, pues, contar un poco desde mi experiencia y, pues, espero que sea usado, pues, de manera benéfica. Para simplificar mi historia de vida, lo voy a narrar como en sucesos y etapas que viví desde la infancia. Creo que mi vida inicia desde los 5 años y es en ese preciso momento cuando asesinan a mi papá en el comedor de la casa donde vivíamos. Y mi mamá, pues, en ese momento le tocó, pues, como pudo, mantenernos a nosotros y llevarnos, pues, a criarnos. El siguiente suceso importante es cuando tenía ya casi 14 años y es en ese momento cuando el ejército colombiano realizó un operativo y en ese momento se llevaron a 23 personas junto con mi mamá. Esto fue bastante complejo para nosotros porque básicamente quedamos huérfanos, tanto de padre como de madre, porque mi mamá pues ya estaba en la cárcel. Y básicamente nos tocaba que lidiar, pues, vernos por sí solos nosotros. Quedé pues yo con mi hermano menor. Y en este preciso momento, ya tenía casi 14 años cuando tomó la decisión de vincularme al grupo armado denominado FARC. Tomo la decisión porque pues básicamente quedé solo y en venganza también de lo que había sucedido. En este grupo armado duré hasta cuando iba a cumplir casi los 17 años y es en este momento cuando me di cuenta y me enteré pues que el grupo armado en el que estaba había asesinado a mi papá. Entonces la intención mía era vincularme a un grupo armado también que se llama paramilitares, que se le denominaba en ese momento. Y los paramilitares me pagaban incluso 1.500.000 para que me vinculara con ellos. Por cosas de la vida, terminé vinculado al proceso de reintegración porque una persona me entregó al DAS en ese momento. Y una de las palabras que a mí nunca se me han olvidado es que este funcionario del DAS me dijo en ese momento: bienvenido a la libertad. Después de que nos interrogaron, porque nosotros nos volamos 3 personas del grupo armado, nos interrogaron, nos metieron al calabozo y en ese calabozo duré casi 15 días. Todos los días nos decían que nos iban a matar. Afortunadamente logré pues continuar, ya nos vincularon al proceso como tal y pero siempre venía como esa zozobra de, pues, de no tener nada porque llegar a una ciudad y básicamente tener lo que tenía puesto. Cuando tenía los 17 años no tenía sino lo que tenía puesto y el único conocimiento que tenía era lo relacionado con la guerra, porque lo que había estudiado anteriormente, que era hasta quinto de primaria, pues básicamente la educación en zona rural en Colombia en ese momento era muy básica y a duras penas sabía leer y muy poco sabía escribir. Entonces básicamente estaba como en una situación de analfabeta. Lo que pasó es que me sacaron de el monte, estaba en el monte y terminé en una ciudad grandísima como lo es Bogotá, que es pues la capital de Colombia, ¿sí? Y básicamente el éxito de mi proceso ha sido una cantidad de sucesos. Una, pues también el vínculo familiar es muy importante porque he visto casos de muchos compañeros míos que incluso las familias los rechazan después de haber salido del grupo armado. También tengo, por ejemplo, haber conocido personas fabulosas, personas que le brinden ese calor de hogar y calor de humanidad, más que todo. Me siento muy afortunado incluso de haber conocido a doña Estela Duque por medio de su fundación, que es Taller de Vida, nos brindó como ese calor de humanidad que tanto le hacía falta a las personas cuando salen del grupo armado. Y yo creo que esta es una de las falencias más importantes de la sociedad y es que sale, pues viene el tema de estigma. Muchas veces nosotros nos estigmatizan por haber estado en un grupo armado, pero nunca se preguntan el por qué uno terminó vinculándose al grupo armado. Y es ahí cuando le cierran las puertas y muchas veces los muchachos terminan reincidiendo. Entonces, es como una situación que a nosotros nos afecta mucho y lo pude ver ahorita en el proceso de paz, porque afortunadamente llevo 10 años trabajando en los medios audiovisuales, he trabajado en muchos canales y de televisión y afortunadamente pude grabar el proceso de paz, cómo se llevó con las FARC, incluso grabé a los compañeros que habían sido míos en el grupo armado y pude notar también cómo retornaban otra vez a vincularse a grupo residual que hoy en día se le denomina las disidencias de las FARC. Y fue por eso, porque muchas veces se les negaron oportunidades y no les mostraron otro mundo que pueden explorar y en el cual pues también pueden fluctuar y vivir de manera pues buena y aportarle también a la sociedad. Los dejo con una reflexión y es la que a mí me quedó desde cuando inicié mi proceso y es el efecto mariposa. El efecto mariposa es algo que hoy en día, por ejemplo, en este momento, uno lo mira insignificante, y es un aporte que le brinden a uno, pero a futuro puede ser algo muy grande, puede ser muy bueno, como también puede ser muy malo, ¿sí? En el caso mío, por ejemplo, asesinaron a mi papá cuando yo tenía 5 años y uno le queda eso acá, esa sensación de venganza y en cualquier momento lo va a hacer, ¿sí? Cuando ya tuve la capacidad, ahí sí, fui, cobré venganza, ya estando en la guerrilla y eso. Pero ya cuando salí del grupo armado, personas buenas que me aportaron mucho a mi reintegración, me brindaron ese calor de humanidad, hoy en día lo estoy reintegrando a la sociedad. Y es por esto que hoy en día tengo incluso un proyecto audiovisual el cual me permite pues como devolver esa capacidad de lo que he podido estudiar. Incluso tengo un título universitario. Hoy en día gozo de las 3 virtudes que debe tener una persona en la sociedad, como lo es tener un arte, una profesión y un oficio. Y lo cual hoy en día lo utilizo en beneficio tanto de mi familia como de la comunidad de la que me rodea. Entonces, la invitación es eso, a que no sea solamente un proceso que tome, por ejemplo, un mes o un año y ya. La solución no es traer los niños de la guerra y traerlos a la ciudad y se acabó el problema. No, el problema es, para darle solución a esto es a largo plazo. Yo tengo amigos que incluso hoy en día son abogados, que son médicos y que estuvieron en un grupo armado, como tengo amigos que también salieron y lo que terminaron fue vinculándose de nuevo a un grupo armado y terminaron siendo asesinados. Una estadística básica: nosotros desertamos siendo 3 personas y un compañero mío lo contrataron para ser sicario en el 2012, lo asesinaron y lo enterramos en el pueblo porque básicamente eso fue lo único que encontró en la vida civil. El otro compañero mío logró vincularse a los paramilitares y asesinó a una persona y terminó pues pagando como 8 años de cárcel y pues ya está de nuevo otra vez en la sociedad. Pero entonces esa es como el mensaje que nos deja la reintegración, que es algo a largo plazo.
Sí, yo
Muchas
estoy de
gracias.
acuerdo con Ferley, gracias Ferley, estoy de acuerdo. Ese es uno de los grandes retos, que los procesos de reintegración tengan una mayor inversión de los estados y de verdad se acompañe, como lo ha dicho Ferley, un proceso a largo plazo, porque si no es así, es muy difícil que se vuelva a ser parte de esta sociedad civil, porque no es un solo derecho el que se vulneró, son muchos derechos, pero también son muchos los daños que sufre ese ser humano y esa persona, y hay que reconstruir todo un tejido colectivo, todo un tejido social, un tejido de participación y asegurar también una existencia ciudadana en medio de la sociedad civil. Muchísimas gracias por escuchar.
Mucho gusto.
Thank you so much, Ferley, for sharing your story in this space. It really was incredible to hear, and yours is really a success story. And I think it's just really brave of you to come and share that. And I also want to say, for people who are watching, Ferley had shared with us Ferley had shared with us a documentary that he made about his life. And so we will try to find that and share that also in the chat for those who are interested in following. And Stella, also for you, thank you so much for sharing. And I think just hats off to your organization for all the work that it's doing with respect to rehabilitation of children affected by armed conflict and promoting their inclusion in society. I want to now just move on in the interest of time to our fourth speaker, who is Ms. Rizan Sheikh Daler, and she supports a tremendous civil society effort in Iraq. The campaign is entitled My Name is My Mother's, and it brings together activists and organizations, parliamentarians, and others who are advocating for legal identity rights of children born in Iraq who are denied registration under their mother's names and consequently denied identity documents because their fathers, who are associated with ISIS, are missing or unknown or deceased. Rizan, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
مساء الخير. طبعا شكرا إلى أستاذة دينيشا. أنا ريزان من العراق ودورتين سابقتين برلمانية. طبعا عندنا حملة اسم أمي، وهذه طبعا حملة كبيرة وخاصة داخل دولتنا كدولة العراق. مع الأسف بعد 2014 كل لدى الكل معلومة بعد هجمة كبيرة من قبل الدواعش. يعني مع الأسف بعض المحافظاتنا احتل بإيد الدواعش، وخاصة منطقة الأنبار وموصل، وخاصة بهذه المنطقة منطقة مهمة كاسم شنغال، وبها مجموعة من الإيزيديين. هذه هم قومية معينة مو مسلمين. مع الأسف يعني أنا كأحكي خاصة على هذه الحملة أساساً كمختصة بعملنا اليوم على حقوق الأطفال وعلى دور المجتمع المدني ودور UN ودور كلنا شو نسوي لهذه الأطفال كأوضاعهم حالياً سيئة جداً، خاصة هذه الأطفال يتولدوا من إيد الدواعش من الأمهات إزيديات، وهذه الأمهات الإزيديات مو مسلمات وهم عراقيات، وأغلب الدواعش لحد الآن اغتصبوا أو هذه طبعا مجموعة من الإمرأة التجار بهذه النساء، وهذه النساء طبعا صارت سبيات بأغلب الدول مع الأسف إحنا نقول. وطبعا هم عن نتيجة الاغتصاب يتولدوا مجموعة من الأطفال وهذه الأطفال كهذا موضوع مهم جدا، لازم إحنا اليوم نحكي على هذه الأطفال من 2014. اليوم إحنا ب 2022 هذه الأطفال اتولدوا لحد هذه اللحظة بدون أي بطاقة وطنية، هوية أو جنسية. وهذا طبعا مشكلة كبيرة، وهم ما عنده حق أي ينسب هذه الأطفال إلى نسب الأم، وهذا هم خطير جدا داخل بلدنا. مع العلم إحنا نحكي على مساواة بالجنسية. طبعا داخل العراق من 2006 العراق دولة داخل شرعنا قانون مساواة بالجنسية موجود، يعني العراقي يقدر يطلع الجنسية من أب أجنبي أو أطفاله أطفاله يتولدون من الأب الأجنبي. أما مشكلتنا قبل الجنسية لازم عندك عقد زواج، وهم إذا ما عندك عقد زواج هذا الأم ما عنده أصلاً نحكي على هذه الطفل. وهم عندنا قانون آخر داخل هذه القانون، أي طفل يتولد خارج عقد الزواج هذا الطفل حتى إذا كان معلوم أب ما معلوم مباشرة هذا الطفل يصير مسلم. وبعد داعش أكبر مشكلة لدينا هذه النساء الإزيديات اغتصبوا وعندهم أولاد هم إزيديين، مستحيل يقبلون العائلة اليزيدية. الفئة الإزيديين هم قبلوا نسائهم يرجعون إلى البلد، يرجعون إلى عوائل. مع العلم أغلبهم مغتصبات وعندهم أطفال، أما قبلوا النساء بدون قبول إلى الأطفال. يعني إذا كان إحنا امرأة ونعرف يعني شنو وضع الأم عن نتيجة الاغتصاب، يتولد الطفل وهذه الطفل مو من حقه يرجع وياها فقط لوحدها. أنا عندي أمثلة بوقت الدواعش، يعني كحرر المناطق، أكو امرأة قال أنا عندي طفل يعني اتولد من الداعش، قال كان 2 سنين. هم دخلوا قوات الحشد الشعبي والجيش العراقي بهذا الوقت، سألوا عن أي امرأة كان يطلع من إيد الداعش، يقول هذا الطفل شو وقت اتولدت بإيد الداعش لو من القبل كان عندك هذا الطفل؟ قالت امرأة، قال يعني أنا خفت، يعني شو أسوي لأنه أريد هذا الطفل تبقى لي. إذا أقول هذا الطفل اتولدت من إيد الداعش مباشرة يأخذون الطفل من الأمهات. قال يعني أنا بمرحلة ما أعرف أرجع يم الداعش لو أرجع إلى بلدي. يعني شوف، لأنه إذا امرأة تعرف إذا كان يرجع إلى بلده إلى مكان يأخذون طفل منها وما عنده حق حتى بعد يشوف هذا الطفل، وما عنده حق بعد يسأل على هذا الطفل، هذا صعب. إحنا مجموعة هذا الوقت أنا كانت نائبة، فكرنا شلون نقدر نساعد هذه الأطفال، لأنه دولة العراق حسب إحصائية من قبل رئيس الوزراء حيدر العبادي ب 2016 بمؤتمر بجنيف هذا الوقت، هو قال 6000 أطفال اتولدوا من الدواعش من الأم العراقي. أنا حالياً ما أقول 6000، أنا أقول إذا كان 1000 طفل، ما أقول إذا 1000، إذا 100 طفل، 100 طفل إذا بدون هوية بدون شلون الدولة لازم تتعامل ويا هذه الأطفال؟ وكانت صعبة جداً حتى ويا UN. أول اجتماعنا ويا ب 2000 وتقريباً 15-16 ويا كل السفراء من الاتحاد الأوروبي وسفير الأمريكي بهذا الوقت، طلبنا هذه الأطفال يتولدوا وهسه موجودين بالعراق حتى مكانهم مبين. يعني إذا كان أنا أقول شيء يمكن أنتم ما عندكم تصديق لهذه الفكرة. هذه الأطفال يعني حتى طبعا هذه الأطفال لحد الآن ما عندهم مكان معين. أنتم تعرفون هذا الأطفال بالسجون، يعني بالسجن يعيشون، يعني أي إنسان يتحمل هذا الوضع، يعني أطفال بدون أي ذنب. حتى أطفال أنا زرت السجون كأمهاتهم محكومين بالدواعش، أمهات بس بالآخر أطفال وياهم. طفل أطفال يعني ولد بمكان، والله العظيم إنسان ما يتحمل فقط يشوف هذا المكان. احتراما مو إنسان يقدر يعيش بهذا المكان. هذا يتعاملون مع العلم هذه الأطفال بالآخر أمهاتهم عراقيات، حتى إذا كان أمهاتهم، المهم طفل موجودة بهذه البلد، إحنا لازم نساعد هذه الأطفال. وهم أكيد UN كلهم، UNHCR UN يونيسيف عندهم علم على هذه الحياة هاي الأطفال، ولحد هذه اللحظة ما بها أي حلول لهم. كلنا نحكي على تهيئة الطفل مرة أخرى إلى المجتمع، كلنا نحكي هذه الأطفال لازم، بعض الأطفال رجعوا إلى بلدنا هم أعمارهم 5 سنوات 6 سنوات، أما على تدريبات الدواعش، يعني أمام عيون هذه الأطفال هم ذبح الناس. يعني شلون أنت تتعامل ويا هاي الأطفال بدون هوية، بدون أي تهيؤ للعيشة الكريمة، بدون إنه حتى عنده حتى دراسة، ما عندهم ولا دراسة ولا شيء، وكل البلد اهمل هذه الفئة المهمة. بهذا الوقت ما عندي وقت خلاص.
Hi, Rizan. Yes, I'm sorry. This is really interesting. And I want to thank you so much for sharing. And I think you really hit the nail on the head that these children are being, in a sense, criminalized, and really they should be treated as victims, and preserving and protecting, ensuring that their right to identity is ultimately protected is really of critical importance. And thank you so much for the work that you are doing in that regard. I would like to now turn to our final contributor in this session, who is CRC committee member Anne Skelton. She's unfortunately unable to be here with us today because of a prior engagement, but she has kindly shared a video presentation, and she will be talking about some of the situations that the committee has had to grapple with respect to this issue of children affected by armed conflict. And so I'm going to invite my colleagues to play her video now, and then we will come together again afterwards. Thank you.
The issue of identity came up for the Committee on the Rights of the Child in a very direct way in one of its communications that it received under the optional protocol on a communications procedure. Just to briefly explain, this is a complaints procedure which allows individuals, groups of individuals, to bring cases to the committee and to ask for a finding of violations and to ask for redress. Now, in this case, the complainants or the authors of this communication were the grandparents of children of foreign fighters. The mothers and the children were in camps in northern Syria. Indeed, some of them still are there. And grandparents of the were living in and had to bring the children back so that they could be looked after by the grandparents. Now, France was the respondent in the case, and they said that the first complaint that they rejected, the first part of this complaint that they rejected, was the idea that the grandparents could bring this case on behalf of the children, because usually these complaints cannot be brought anonymously. So there needs to be a real person bringing the case, and if the case is brought on behalf of a child, that should be with the child's consent. Now, that of course also depends on whether the child is old enough to consent. Here in this case, some were, but most were very young. But another issue was whether or not someone could consent on their behalf, because they are actually living with their mothers. And so in a sense, the French government argued, no one else can make decisions on behalf of the children other than their guardians, and their guardians are not able to do that because we couldn't get into contact with them. Even the grandparents had only intermittent contact. So the committee had to decide whether this lack of clear identity of the children, clear consent by the children. Some of the children had been born in the camps, so their birth dates were not precisely known. Their names were not precisely known, but we knew they were there, and their grandparents were pretty clear on the number of children and who their mothers were. And so we decided that we would allow this communication, even though it was sort of partially, let's say, not anonymous, but with gaps in the identity information. And it was important for us to do that because it was such a serious case that it would have been a tragedy for it to falter just on the first point of anonymity and identity. So having then decided that, the committee decided again that the case was admissible. And why there was a question mark over this is because France said, these children do not belong within our jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction is France. And the way that human rights generally works is countries are responsible for the people, including the children, within their territorial jurisdiction, and not necessarily for the rights of their citizens once their citizens go abroad. However, states are always able to advance consular services on behalf of their citizens in other countries. So the committee decided in the end that France did have jurisdiction over these children. In other words, they were able to act on their behalf using consular service. And given the dire circumstances that the children were living in the camps, very dangerous conditions for their health, they were lacking education, they were lacking health services, many children have died in these camps. It obviously was a very unusual set of circumstances. And in that case, we felt that France's ability to help the children translated into an obligation to help them, because if they didn't help them, their right to life, survival, and development was immediately placed at risk, together with a number of other rights that were at risk as well. Now, in some of the scholarship, some of the criticisms and comments that have come out about this case, one line of criticism is that the committee should not have based their decision on nationality, because that might be too narrow. So in another case, one might want to argue that children need assistance even if they're not the citizens of a particular country. And I understand that. But on the other hand, I think it was important in this case that the nationality created a link between France and the children. And it wasn't the basis on which we made the finding. It was one of the factors put all together that made it possible for France to act on behalf of the children, and therefore, according to the committee, necessary for France to act on behalf of them. And in the end, the committee found the case admissible and found that France had violated the rights of the children and called on France to make all good faith efforts to bring those children back to France. So I think this is also, looking at identity and citizenship linked together. This is rather an interesting case that brings those issues to the fore and shows how in very practical ways the committee, under its communications procedure, is having to grapple with identity issues.
So although Anne isn't here with us today, I'd just like to really thank her for that really interesting contribution. At this stage, I would like to invite all of the panelists to put their cameras on. I know that we've gone over time a little bit. I think it was a really dynamic discussion. And so as opposed to asking you all multiple questions, I'm just going to end this session by asking you each the same question in the interest of time. And so I'm going to start with you, Dragika. And I'd like to ask you, if you could speak to any recent positive developments that you've identified in your respective, for all of you in your respective areas of work. Can you share your thoughts on what more states and civil society, and also those with lived experience, can do to ensure that these developments continue to progress?
Indeed, it has been really interesting to listen to colleagues, and Colombia and Iraq are both on the children and conflict agenda. So really, really great to hear those perspectives. We are particularly concerned about the situation in Iraq with a lack of birth registration for children that Rezan has spoken about. And one of the key tools of our mandate is to dialogue with parties who are committing these violations. And once they're designated in the Secretary General's annual report, for those of you who don't know our agenda, we have the mandate to talk to them about basically a range of actions that are time-bound that will enable preventing and ending these grave violations. And one of the things that we talk about is legislation. I'm really glad that Mikiko, in her welcoming remarks, mentioned our press release that we jointly published in September on purpose, just out of the third committee session, because the group of us who came together to reinforce the age of a child per CRC is under 18 is because we are observing that member states are looking for loopholes. One of the cases we're working on right now is a difficult one with Afghanistan. It's particularly that group of children between 15 and 18 that we worry about in contexts such as countering violent extremism and in dealings with certain groups. So just wanted to say that. And with that in mind, the partnership and coordination with other special rapporteurs and other UN agencies and bodies for us is critical to keep reminding member states of their commitments, of the range of human rights that need to be upheld under the convention, regardless of, children's age, gender, status, country of origin, location. And their obviously right to identity and birth registration. And with that, I wanted to also mention OPAC because colleagues from Colombia spoke extensively about reintegration. I'm sorry to the translators for speaking so quickly. We really need to, reinforce that the 172 countries that have committed and ratifying this instrument need to implement it, and those who haven't signed or ratified need to as well. Children have a right to, once released from having been recruited and used, receive long-term sustainable gender and age-sensitive, disability-inclusive reintegration programs, and none of these services are available to them, are possible without their, a right to nationality and legal identity. So anyone who can echo those messages with us is really valuable. And on the point of counterterrorism, because it keeps coming up, our sort of core message is to remind member states to refrain from rendering individuals, notably children, stateless. Their right to nationality is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the CRC, and numerous other treaties, not to mention, and that safeguards and processes that protect people from becoming stateless must be put in place. So I'm hopeful about the initiative that at least we have around action plans, and now emergingly, so prevention plans to really try to discuss what is needed to put these roadblocks in place so that we don't have the issue come up so much, at least in the remit of our agenda. But there's a lot more scope and room for us to think this through the CAC agenda lens.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dragika. And Stella, Rezan, would you like to offer a short answer on where you see progress and what more should be done?
Sí, yo quisiera decir que lo positivo que veo y lo que creo que también ayuda a resolver estas situaciones tienen que ver con las fortalezas de los jóvenes y las jóvenes que han salido del conflicto armado. Hay algo que ocurre en Colombia y es lo que ha dicho Ferley, de jóvenes que crean sus proyectos. Lo mismo hacen otros grupos de jóvenes que tuvieron la oportunidad de estar en taller de vida en este caso, bueno, jóvenes como Ferley, como Gina, como María Alejandra, como tantos otros, que como sobrevivientes de conflicto armado y hoy como ciudadanos de un país que por fin los reconoce, crean sus propias propuestas de proyecto para acompañar a otros niños y niñas que han vivido el conflicto armado. Yo creo que eso es un acto de coraje, de valentía que las organizaciones internacionales y de cooperación deben respaldar y acompañar, y ese llamado lo hacemos también. Yo hago parte de Family for Every Child, somos organización miembro y tenemos que acompañar este tipo de procesos e invito a las demás organizaciones a mirar estos movimientos que surgen de sobrevivientes que dan respuestas, que se atreven y que, por ejemplo, en Colombia acompañan un proceso de veeduría desde sus voces frente a los posibles acuerdos de paz. Y lo otro es fortalecer nuestras organizaciones. Creo, y le diría a la compañera que ha hablado, desde todo, contándonos toda esta situación de guerra, te diría que en Colombia también se vivió el tener hijos que nacen de la guerra, pero tenemos que fortalecernos como organizaciones, continuar, mantener los procesos y fortalecer estas posibilidades de diálogo para lograr el cambio. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Stella. I'm going to final word to Rizan, and then we will wrap up this session. Thank you.
طبعا أشكركم. مع الأسف ترجمة كلش يعني قليل يوصل يمي، أما بالآخر طبعا هذه الأطفال ضروري جدا، مو فقط عراق مسؤولة عن هذه الأطفال، كلنا مسؤولين عن هذه الأطفال كهسه موجودة ببلدنا، بلد العراق أو بلد بالآخر. هذه الأطفال بالأطفال العالم، عالم يصير. إحنا إذا كان نعمل على الأطفال لازم على كل العالم نعمل، وخاصة ببلدنا. عملنا الجدي لازم هذه الأطفال، إحنا عندنا هذه الحملة، حملة اسمي اسم أمي، يعني أنا الأم موجودة، من حقي هوية، يطلع الهوية هذه الطفل باسمي، لأنه أنا عندي وجود وأنا عراقية. أما مشكلتنا داخل بلدنا حسب القانون الجنسية، هذه الطفل يصير مسلم، وداخل بلدنا مسيحيين موجودين، إزيديين موجودين، هم مو مسلمين، وهذه الأمهات من حقهم. وبعد داخل القانون أي طفل يتولد يصير مسلم ويصير باسم الأب، حتى إذا كان ما عنده أب لازم عنده أب وهمي. إحنا كنائبات كمنظمات المجتمع المدني عملنا لازم للتعديل القانون، حتى هذه القانون يطلع الاسم الطفل يصير باسم الأم والأب، مو فقط الأب. في دولة ذكورية إحنا حتى داخل، مع الأسف أقول، الشريعة الإسلامية، قوانيننا لازم مصدر الأساسي من الشريعة الإسلامية، الشريعة الإسلامية يرجع إلى أب وذكورية، بس بالآخر هذا صارت مشكلة كبيرة، وهذا جرائم داخل بلدنا. لازم يغير قوانيننا، وهذه القانون ما يتغير بجهود فقط منظمات الداخلية ونائبات ومجموعة من الشخصيات ونشطاء المجتمع المدني، يحتاج إلى دعم دولي، دعمكم، لأنه هذه الأطفال باكر هسه حاليا بأفكارهم دواعش وموجودة. لازم إحنا نهيئ الأطفال، إذا ما عنده عراقي وما عنده هوية بعد شنو انتماءه لهذه الدولة، شنو انتماءها للإنسانية. لهذا أنا أشكركم جدا وأدعي لكم، أنتم لازم تساعدنا سوية، نساعد. أنتم مررتوا بهذه المشاكل وشفت الدول الأخرى مشاكلهم شلون حلت، حتى إحنا هم بالعراق من قبل سفارات، من قبل UN. لازم يركزون على أطفال أول شيء قبل الأمهات. يعني أنا أقول أمهات هم ضحايا، خلاص وضعهم صعبة، بس هسه أطفالهم بحاجة إلى أمهم، بحاجة إلى هوية، بحاجة إلى خدمة اعتيادية كي يعيشون مثل أي طفل. حاليا قانون الطفل على أروقة البرلمان العراقي، لازم ندعم حتى هذا قانون حماية الطفل. بالآخر حماية الطفل، هذا الطفل، كل طفل لازم عنده هوية، لازم معلومة أمها، حتى نخدم هذه القانون ونشرع القانون داخل مجلس النواب بوجودكم. أنا أشكركم، عفوا على الإطالة.
Thank you so much, Reizan. And I would like to thank
Sí,
all
yo
of the
quisiera
panelists.
yo quisiera decirle a Rizán que estemos aquí todos unidos y estés hablando es un gran paso para avanzar hacia estas leyes y hacia ese movimiento. Creo que hoy dimos ese gran paso.
I mean, I would just really like to thank all of you on this panel. I think it has been extremely engaging and just really such a dynamic group of people coming together from different aspects and different backgrounds to talk through this issue. And I just really want to thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much, Furley, for sharing your story, which has really inspired so many people. I could already tell from the conversations that we're seeing. I want to hand over to Mia. I'm going to close the session here, and Mia has a few words for you, and then we will start again in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you for that excellent panel. I really, really was inspired and challenged about the different work that you're doing. Now we will have another intermission. Again, we will have some drawings from Ukraine. This time they will be focusing on what happens to children when they're separated from their families. But we'd like to end on some hope that these children have in their last drawings of what they see as their future. It is a bright future. It is one without war. It is one where they're together with their families, and it is one with peace. Without further ado, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll start again the last session for today. Thank you, everybody.
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to our third and final session of this symposium on children's identity rights in the context of emergencies. This particular panel will focus on the context of children on the move. And just before we get started, I would like to thank our partners who have co-sponsored this event, including the Committee on the Rights of the Child, UNICEF, UNHCR, Special Representative for the Secretary General for Children Affected by Armed Conflict, as well as CRC Connect, the European Network on Statelessness, Family for All, the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, the International Commission on Civil Status, and as well the International Federation on Social Work. Just before we get started with the session, I'd like to remind people that we have interpretation available. And so you can find the languages at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And basically it's all self-explanatory with the exception of the Arabic translation is labeled as German. So if you require Arabic translation, please choose the German option. I also just want to mention that we are sharing the bios and the agenda for this session in the chat box because we would like to spend as much time as possible on having our presenters share their presentations. Also, because of that, we are unable to take questions immediately. But if you do have questions or comments, or if you are working on any of these issues and would like to share your experience, if you could kindly just share that in the question answer box, we will hopefully be able to review those questions and comments and eventually revert bilaterally if possible and where necessary. I think I would also maybe just to mention that this presentation is being recorded. And so we will ensure that the recorded version is available and shared with you once that is ready. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our moderator for this session, Ms. Mia Dumbach, who will go ahead with the session 3. Thank you.
Thanks, Danisha, for that. So now we come to this last session for the day. We're talking about emergency settings, and as we know that emergencies can result in children moving. Sometimes they're unaccompanied, sometimes they're separated, sometimes they are moving with their families, but they are moving. And so with that, we'd like to first have our first speaker today is Ms. Razia Sultana from the Rohingya Women's Welfare Society, who will talk about the denial of identity as well as nationality for Rohingya people, including children in exile, and the implications for these children. Thank you, Razia, because I know that it's late where you are, but thank you for staying with us and sharing with us your experience.
Thank you so much. I'm Razia Sultana. And thank you for letting me say something about the Rohingya issue. I am belong with the Rohingya community in Bangladesh and brought up in Bangladesh. And I am a founder of RW Welfare Society who works for the Rohingya women camp. And I will say that the Rohingya refugee crisis is a genocidal humanitarian disaster that has gone separately. Not everyone is aware of what exactly is happening to these people. This is an intensified conflict between the majority Buddhist Burmese and the minority Muslim who were formerly living in the Arakan, its new name is the Rakhine State, within the province of Myanmar. First, there are still questions why Rohingya face this identity complexity and what is the motive. The Rohingya were rendered stateless and left wondering helplessly about their identity. The problem with Rohingya identity is that it encompasses multi-ethnic groups. The answers to the question why the Rohingya minority was not considered an ethnic group along with the recognized 135 ethnic group in Myanmar has its political, ideological, and cultural dimension. As international law, we know any ethnic group has the right to restore their unrecognized ethnic identity. The Rohingya identity crisis began when they were devastated citizenship law. The Rohingya people used to have a national NRC like everyone else in the country, Myanmar, and all name is the Burma. Upon the introduction of discriminatory policies on Rohingya by Ne Win in the 1970s, the NRC were taken away by various measures. The Myanmar government has effectively institutionalized discrimination against the ethnic group through restriction on marriage, family planning, employment, education, religious trust, and freedom of movement. The first exodus was in 1978 when the military began the Naga Dragon King to find the Dragon King operation to find and take action against the Persian military junta deemed to be illegal migrants. The operation targeted Rohingya in Rakhine State. The government claimed that the Rohingya people were foreigners rather than an ethnic minority of Myanmar. During this operation, many Rohingya had their official documentation taken away by interagency team of inspectors. As a result, more than 200,000 Rohingya fled across the border into Bangladesh in 1979. They were repatriated after a bilateral agreement between the authorities of Bangladesh and Myanmar. However, most of the Rohingya who returned were homeless, excluded from all government sector, and stayed without documentation, proper documentation. The Rohingya refugees are threatened by perpetual stateless. Most of these refugees are women and children. The Rohingya have no official evidence of citizenship, no passport, no education or official career, as well as many restrictions on their movement. This issue of Rohingya identity is so crucial since this ethnic minority will remain stateless forever. The dilemma of the Rohingya is either to stay in Myanmar and be killed or to escape to neighboring countries and be considered refugee. The crisis is addressed as an outcome of illegal migrants. The late mass exodus of Muslim Rohingya to Bangladesh began on August 25, 2017. After some Rohingya militia attacks, about 30 police posts and an army group. This was followed by a massive military counter-offensive by the security force in Myanmar and the horrific atrocities committed against Rohingya women and girls by the Burmese military, particularly sexual violence. Moreover, from the time when the military crackdown broke out in August 2017, more than 1 million Rohingya had fled Myanmar to neighboring Bangladesh. The attack on Rohingya village in August 2017 were a systematic effort to drive them out and had been described as an ethnic cleansing, but truly it is a genocide. And I will say that there is so many times refugees come and go, and still in the 90s, refugees are stuck in Bangladesh registered camp who are maybe have a refugee status, but they have no right for proper education, proper decent life. Even if they have a unique checker, but they have no right to move even in Bangladesh, and even if they wish to go outside, but there is no proper mechanism for them. It's like they are nowhere people. After the 2017 influx, and these people are take shelter in Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar refugee camp. But we say it's refugee camp, but these people have no refugee status, and they are mentioned as a forced displaced people. And this it is almost a 5 year. There is no improvement, about the repatriation, and about their life is just stuck in the camp, and the children's future is, I think they have no future, because there is no formal education, no livelihood, even if the camp is surrounded with the police, and day by day aid is become decreased, and the proper essential things are not getting. It's a worse situation for them. And every time we are telling about the repatriation issue, but it still is in the paper, and international community only they are maybe provide some aid, but it needs to be more focus of how to the issue, because this law cannot stay in other countries. And yes, I'm thankful to Bangladesh because they give them the shelter, but they cannot live here forever. And we also, as a result, we are seeing, because there is no education, no opportunity, children become aggressive. And we also see, because this is a border area, and trafficking and drugs is not an issue. So these people are stuck in this criminal activity. So it is a very threat for not only for Bangladesh for this reason. And I will also ask and tell you about the massive massacre in the last 2010 and 12 in Chitwe in Rakhine State. These people, most of the Rohingya and some Muslim and also other ethnics, they are forcibly displaced in Myanmar, and they are in now IDP 10, and their future also bad, because children not getting any opportunity in their own country, and they are not allowed to go their own land. What they see is not so far, it's just like 1 mile ago. But I am asking the international community. That time everyone said that this is an internal problem, but I'm saying that this is land of these people. What happened to land? And when you see this land is now in the industrial zone, and it is funded by the international community. So how can you say it is an internal conflict? It's not an internal conflict, it is international, because everyone focus on the business, not the real issue. And I'm not only talking about the Rohingya issue, there are other ethnics also facing the same situation inside in the Myanmar. Thank you. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Razia. It's really heartbreaking to see what's happening to the Rohingya people and the fact that they can't access basic services. I also saw that you had written notes, because some of the interpretation was a bit, the sound wasn't fantastic. Perhaps we can have the written document, or we can share that with the panelists, with the other participants afterwards. What I think we will have now is that Razia has shared a video of some of the implications of people with lived experience that we will show. It's going to be, the English translation will be in the chat function for everybody to understand what's happening. Thank you.
এই দেশে তোরার মাইতে আরে তো দেশলা তোরা তো
মারে মাইজে তো মালিক লিলো আর আমার বিজিদের আরা বতং করে গর করেন কয়ে কিরা লার আন্দার তো ফরতা কি তোদ নিজের দেশলা আর মনে হলে মরিলে যাইম বয়া হইরে নিজের দেশে যাইরে বলে হার গনি মারে এড়ে বেশি শুকরিয়া জানো শুকরিয়া আলহামদুলিল্লাহ কিয়ামত মার তখন ফরাইতা না আরে লজেলি কো যাবা গই যাইম বই যেটা সাথে হ্যাঁ যাইম বই ইয়া কালা আরে থাকি দা ইয়া কি আরা দনে দেনো আর কোন অতন নয়া শুকরিয়া আলহামদুলিল্লাহ।
Thank you, Razia, for sharing that video of these ladies and the heartbreak of not being able to be back in their country without an identity or being recognised. We will come back to you at the end for some questions, but before then, we now move to South Africa, to Daniela Lima Rodriguez and Liesl Mueller from the Centre for Child Law, University of Pretoria, and to look at the use of strategic litigation to protect children's identity rights. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, so I'm Daniela Lima Rodriguez. I'm 14 years old. Basically, how it all started, I was born in Cape Town, 2018, and my parents had immigrated from Cuba in 2016. When I was born, my parents were no longer residents of Cuba because of a few laws, and they weren't citizens of South Africa either, so I couldn't be categorized in anything. The laws kind of made it so I fell right in between. And thank you, after years of fighting, there were these amazing lawyers that finally got something to change. I'm now a Cuban citizen, and I have the right to a South African citizenship if we would want to proceed further. Growing up, I didn't really understand what happened because I was too young to understand, but I remember the first time I really understood what happened. I was watching a YouTube video that they'd made of me when I was around 6 or 8-ish, and I just started crying because I realized that my life, if nothing happened, was not going to be the same as other children. I wasn't going to be able to go to college or just live out my dreams that I really wanted to happen. When I realized what happened, it definitely, it left me with a few, like an identity crisis of sort, because I'm labeled as an immigrant in the country I was born in. And I don't know anything else of South Africa. And yes, I identify with Cuba because my parents are Cuban. I should be legally Cuban, which is what I am now. But I feel like I should also be South African. I grew up here. I grew up with this culture. When I went to Cuba, finally, I experienced culture shock. There are just so many children that will always be stateless because they don't have the facilities, or their parents are just too scared, or they can't stand up and say, my child needs this, or they can't fight for this. And honestly, there's so many issues that you never really think of, like, that come with it. I remember my mom, we were talking about this today, and she mentioned the fact that the reason I was never allowed to go anywhere without them was because how were they going to identify me if something was up? If they could only identify me through blood work, because I wasn't in any database. And that's why I can't go anywhere without them. And there's just this trauma that comes along with it. The anxiety, the constant pressure, the who am I? What am I supposed to be? All of this, and so many people deal with it their whole lives. I was lucky enough that I finally got the Cuban citizenship at just I got it when I was in 2019, so when I was like 11. Some people grow up until they're old and they have to live with that forever. And if I'm being honest, I still feel like that clueless child that doesn't know what's going on. All that she knows is that something is wrong and it's gonna affect her future if nothing changes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for that amazing testimony of what it really feels like for children not to have an identity, a legal identity, and to be stateless. And now I turn to Liesl Mueller from the Centre for Child Law, which are these amazing lawyers headed by Carabo. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And I'm very proud of you, Daniela. That was a lovely speech. And I was Daniela's lawyer at Lawyers for Human Rights all those years ago. And it was really a difficult path, as she says. And I'd like to just tell you one or two things about the litigation that we do here. So I do the same kind of litigation on children's identity rights at the Center for Child Law that I did at Lawyers for Human Rights, but now particularly focusing on children. And so there are crucially 4, or let me say rather 5 aspects to the litigation work that we do. And the first one, and let me just say that the people that we represent are always representative of a larger group, and we strive always to resolve a strategic problem. So when we have clients in our law clinic, we start to see trends and we pick up on strategic issues that we'd like to intervene on. And one of the first things that we do always in these cases is ask the court to make a declaration of rights. And like Daniela was saying, that there's always this uncertainty hanging over your head, and being able to prove your rights and being able to show somebody, whether in government or at a school, that you are entitled to the rights, to your fundamental rights, is incredibly stressful. And so one of the first things we always do in our court cases is to ask the court to declare the person's right to the nationality of South Africa in this case, which is what we did in Daniela's case. The second issue that we address quite frequently in South Africa is the issue of proof. So we often deal with cases that are actually about birth registration, but because birth registration is so crucial to acquiring and proving a nationality, of course, that is something that we see as crucial to the process. Now, this is probably actually the most of the cases we receive, and there are various aspects to that. One is that the Department of Home Affairs in South Africa actually applies a higher onus of proof that a court would. And when we take these cases to court, we prove them on a balance of probabilities and get an order which orders the Department of Home Affairs to register a birth. One of those issues that we're dealing with currently is that children of single fathers or fathers who had a child with a foreign mother are required to do a DNA test to prove their paternity. And so at the moment, we are involved in a litigation case where we are proving paternity through other means. So when I say that, you will all be familiar with the presumption of paternity. So it applies where parents are married. It means that when a child is born within wedlock, we assume or we presume that the husband is the father until somebody else proves otherwise. And so this is an important protection for the child. And what we are arguing in this case is that DNA testing is not reasonable, and that there are various additional ways to prove paternity, which should be included in the presumption of paternity. For instance, in South Africa, we have customary practices where if a child was born outside of wedlock, and there is a traditional customary procedure which is negotiated in the community, that is a way to prove paternity. And so we're asking the court to basically develop the law and make the law regarding presumption of paternity broader. Then we also do the kind of work where we force implementation. So for instance, we have really good safeguards in the law. The one that applied to Daniela was the otherwise stateless provision. So we've had this in our law for 25 years, and there's no implementation. So we asked the court to force Home Affairs to draft a regulation which allows application, and that has still not happened. And so that's very sad, but there are some follow-up cases that we're hoping are going to deal with that. We also do the kind of thing which is called a structural interdict. So which is something we would have done with Daniela's case if we knew how hard implementation was going to be. But what it does is we say, that the respondents must do X, Y, and Z, and they must report back to the court in 6 months to tell the court what they've done. So that's something that really helps in these cases. And then my last point that I would just like to make is that we have at the moment quite a few, we don't have the data, but we have cases where children have come into the country after birth. So they're not born in South Africa, but they are stateless. And they are migrant children, often foundling children. And we are considering litigating on this gap in the law. So that's the last thing we do with litigation, is that where we see a gap, we address it and ask the court to order the respondents to fill that gap. And then we also make suggestions on how we think that should look like. So those are the most, I think, interesting things we are working with at the moment. And then I will respond to questions if need be. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Liesl. I think that that's just a very brief overview of the excellent work that the Centre for Child Law does. But now we move on to Nicholas Knorr, the Secretary General for the International Commission on Civil Status, who will be speaking to us about normative instruments that can facilitate the issuance of civil documentation in cross-border contexts and emergency settings. So over to you, Nicholas. I think, Nicholas, you just have to move a bit backwards from your screen so that we can see your face.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope that everything's fine. Thank you for the invitation also. ICCS is an international organization that has adopted 34 conventions and 11 recommendations on civil statutes in the broad sense. A key element exists, the multilingual forms that are annexed to most of the instruments. These are standard forms of civil statutes documents, uniform and therefore the same in all contracting states. Why can they be considered as simplifying elements? The first aspect is that the multilingual forms circulate between the contracting states without requiring legalization, which is a considerable saving of time and, of course, of money. The second aspect is that translation issues are avoided. The translation into the official languages of the different states, parties, of course, to the convention, of the different entries in the document is provided on the document itself for the oldest conventions, or in a lexicon for the most recent ones, which makes it possible to understand the documents through a codec system. The third aspect, the multilingual forms are civil statutes documents, and they have the same evidential value as acts issued in accordance with the rules of domestic law of the issuing state. The most famous example of our conventions is Convention number 16 on the issue of multilingual extracts from civil statutes records. It's in force now in 24 states. Annex 1 contains a multilingual model of birth certificate. Once obtained from the authorities of the place of birth, it will be able to circulate in all the other contracting states without formalities, without the need for translation, which means that it will be able to provide its effects rapidly without any real obstacle, which is essential in urgent situations. That convention has been modernized by Convention number 34, which entered into force between Germany, Belgium, and Switzerland on July of this year. The scope of application is now broader, and the legal regime remains the same for birth certificates. Other states have already expressed interest in that convention, and we expect many ratifications and accessions in the short term. Other elements may also be interesting in our conventions. I don't have the time to develop, but I will just give you one example. Convention number 22 on international cooperation in providing administrative assistance to refugees. Very helpful, of course, both for the refugees, but also for the states, the authorities of the different states concerned. So I think that my time is up. I could give you many more examples of mechanism in our conventions, but I think that the easiest way for you to have such informations is to go on our website, so the website of the International Commission on Civil Statutes. Thank you very much for your attention and your interest in the ICCS.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think that it's a really good recommendation for people to have a look at this website and to have a look at these 34 conventions that have been drafted, and really will help for this cross-border recognition of these important civil status documents, because we keep saying without these documents, we will not have an identity, and the children are at greater risk of exploitation. If you could stay for the end, Nicholas, we have some questions for you. But now I hand over to a very dear friend and colleague, Benoit van Kilsbroek, Committee on the Rights of Child member, and who will also present on the committee's work and also take us forward with some questions with the panelists. Thanks, Benoit.
Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you for inviting me in this very interesting and important event. First of all, I would like to thank Daniela for her intervention. It was so moving, and she just tackled all the important issue that I wanted to address. As member of the committee has different ways to address the issue of right to identity, and especially in the framework, in the frame of children on the move. First of all, we have issued many general comments on the topic, and that deals with the issue of right to identity. I will come back on that in a second. We can decide on individual communication, and Skelton already talked about some of them, but I will highlight another one. And then we, of course, have recommendation to the states that are issued in our concluding observation after the monitoring process when we conduct our monitoring towards every state. So we have three main general comments dealing with children in the migration. First of all, the number 6 from 2005, which deals with the treatment of unaccompanied and separated children outside of their country of origin. And then we have the 22 and 23, which deals with general principle and the state obligation regarding the human rights of children in the context of international migration. The main points that I can highlight now from those general comments is, of course, the importance of birth registration. It's extremely important, it has been highlighted many times today. We know that the fact that a child is not registered, doesn't have proper identity documents and so on, it entails a lot of risks of becoming stateless, of not having the possibility to enjoy many other rights, and including the risk of child marriage, trafficking, forced return, forced recruitment in the frame of child labor, and so on. So the committee recommends to states, and it has been highlighted in those general comments, to immediately register at birth, and this irrespective of the migration status of their parents, because very often what we can see is that many states do not register children when the parents are migration status, and that's of course not acceptable. We ask also the states to remove all legal and practical obstacles when it comes to birth registration, and to prohibit also sharing information concerning the status of a person with immigration enforcement authorities, because otherwise there is a risk for those authorities to use the fact that a person is not with proper identity rights in the country to use it against a person, and this will of course limit the possibilities or the situation where parents will try to identify and to seek for identity rights of their children. In some cases, migrant children or families may have used illegal or irregular documents to migrate and to enter into a country, and the committee very often highlights and recommends the importance to ensure that this is not used against the person. We still recommend also other principle and action from the states to take every appropriate measure to restore the right to an identity, the right to a nationality, to avoid statelessness, and globally also to ensure that all the dimensions of the right to identity are taken into account, including sexual orientation, religion, and other issues. We also, and this is extremely important, we recommend to the states to ensure that there is an access to a child-friendly and gender-sensitive, safe judicial and non-judicial remedies. The importance of remedies has to be highlighted extremely clearly. Otherwise, as we have heard from Daniela, there is no possibility to ensure that a child can recover its identity. I could talk at length also about the cases where we have been intervening, especially for unaccompanied minors in the situation of children who were unable to prove their age, and so that's the issue of the age assessment. And through the OPIC, individual complaints mechanism, we have had to recommend to many states to set in place a system which will guarantee the right for children to have the right assessed, the age assessed in a right and genuine manner, including benefiting of the benefit of the doubt when there is no documents, and other procedure that will cover and ensure that the child has the right to an identity, including its age being assessed properly. I will end up here for the sake of the time, and we can pass to the question to the panelists.
Thanks for that, Benoit. There's definitely much more that can be said, and we promise everybody another event next year with a longer time for each speaker. But Benoit, if you wanted to start the facilitated discussion with the different panelists, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, with pleasure. I wanted to ask to list, first of all, thank you very much for your intervention. It's so great what you are doing in South Africa, and we see how important access to justice is in this kind of situation. But what kind of legal solution and or policies do you see that would be required in South Africa to ensure that identity rights of children on the move, both accompanied or unaccompanied, are really protected as a general measure?
Yes, well, we are very worried about this right at the moment. We have, similarly with the rest of the world, concerns about state security when it comes to identity, issuing of documentation. And so the government approach to documentation and granting of nationality is from a security point of view. And not only undocumented children, not only stateless children or the children of unmarried fathers, but refugee children, asylum-seeking children, any child outside of the family norm, the nuclear family norm, will at some point find it difficult to register a birth or to get a document. And so we are going to be doing a lot of advocacy at parliament level and along with court work. But we need a massive shift in the government's approach to this problem for this right to be protected.
Many thanks, Liz. Indeed, the political will is, of course, key in such a situation. Otherwise, we won't make concrete progress. Razia, thank you very much also for your intervention. It was absolutely moving, and indeed, the situation of Rohingyas is one of the most worrying situations and a very large scale. I wanted to ask you, as an ethnic minority which is denied of identity rights, many of whom are now in exile, what role can human rights bodies like the Committee on Rights of the Child, in which I'm sitting, and civil society organizations working on identity rights can play in order to support the restoration of identity rights of the Rohingyas? What do you expect from the international community in this regard?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, this is very complicated issue because Rohingya were ignored, not only authority, Myanmar government, even the other ethnics. So these, because after the coup, some maximum ethnics, they are now understand what happened to the Rohingya, but not everyone. So in my issue, we have to involve the international community and try to understand that what exactly happened to the Rohingya and who are the Rohingya. Because most of the time we have to face the same question that why you are in this state, and because because our religion is Islam. We are Muslim, but other ethnic, most of the Buddhists. So there is so many conflicts about the history. The history is so many times is decorated, and Arakan itself is it was not part of the Burmese, I think Myanmar, but it is somehow history or about the global politics is now with the Myanmar. But this thing is not understood by our other ethnic people. So I want to give our approach and to, first we have to introduce that what is exactly the Rohingya and why we are denied our, the real history, denied our rights, and we are belong that land. So this is the thing I have to be again ask everyone. You should be give approach, and I ensure that if everyone is understand, because we are now asking about the democracy. Yes, democracy will come. Even in the 2010 it came, but Rohingya are just excluded from in the scenario. But now, if again, I wish it will become again. But this time also we want to back our rights. So this is thing I am requesting everyone in the international community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Razia, and I can tell you that you are doing a wonderful job in just raising awareness and making people see and understand what is at stake and how much this population is suffering of this situation. Thank you so much for your testimony and your work. It's so crucial, and I can tell you that your voice is reaching in the international community, and we will continue to raise awareness on that. Nicholas, I wanted to ask you also something. I found it very interesting, your approach and the work you are promoting, and especially you mentioned the fact that the translation of civil registration document is, of course, very a problem that happens very often. And if we don't need to legalize those documents, it has the potential to unlock many problems that children on the move can face and help establishing and protect child identity rights. In case where there is a limited application. So what are, in your view, the barriers for more universal application, and what are the longer term solutions that need to be implemented to address these challenges? Of course, you have the convention that you mentioned, probably the ratification of those conventions is extremely important, but I let you explain what exactly you think that would help us in improving the situation.
Yes. Thank you very much for your question. I think that most of the countries still believe that legalization is a kind of protection for them. Civil statute concerns sovereignty for most of them. So they need that protection. To find solutions, of course, we need to promote the different instruments existing in that field. I'm very often surprised by the complete ignorance by many states of such instruments. So bilateral conventions, of course, most of the states know that they can conclude such cooperation conventions, but multilateral tools are very often ignored. So I think that we need to stress on that particular point, and that's what we're doing at the ICCS at the moment. I think that many states completely ignore our organization, and so we try to promote it in Europe, of course, but also in Africa, in America, in Asia, just to have more ratifications for our instruments, because very often when people are aware of the existence of such instruments, when they discover them, they consider that they are very good tools. We really need to promote it, and we need also your help for that, of course.
Many thanks, Nicolas. Indeed, those conventions are not so well known, and we need to continue highlighting the importance of them. And at the end of the day, it's also a support for the states. It makes the work of the states more easy and more accessible. And of course, it will ease the situation of migrant people themselves, because they will avoid the burden of going through legalization and translation. So thank you so much, Nicolas, and then I give the floor back to Mia.
Okay. Thanks, Benoit. To conclude, I see that there are a number of questions in the chat function, but we will not have time, as we said at the very beginning, to answer those, but we will share them with the panelists. And then if they are responded to, we will respond back to the individuals that pose those questions. But to end today, I'd like to ask all the panelists in this last session, starting with Razia, and then Daniela, if you would also like to answer this question, also Liesel, and then Nicolas, and then Benoit. A final question to you all, but in that order. If you could highlight one or two positive developments, and what do you think we can do as governments, UN agencies, civil society, to build on those developments? What would be your one message to close off for everyone? Thanks. So starting with Razia. Thanks, Razia.
Can I? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. One thing, don't forget us, because I know the situation after the Ukraine issue. I'm not blaming anyone, but the Rohingya issue is like now in the shadow, and the thing is now become very worse. And it just don't act like, because I know the fun for the Rohingya always there. But not only we are not only working for only fun, but we need to be forward about our rights. And I know there is so many ways international community can do. So this is my request, not only for AIDS, but we have to forward for this people's rights, because they cannot stay in a small area, and they have the children's future. And because they even can't think that their children can go to school, because I think Anisha and you and they know very well our formal education is forbidden in Bangladesh. So let's try how to make our children's future. So this is my request. Thank you.
Thank you, Fazia. I'm not sure, Daniela, did you want to say something as well for us?
So I'm not a professional or anything, obviously, but I do think that it would definitely improve the kids' mental health if you find a way to make home affairs realize how much of an issue it can be. I'm not trying to put the blame on them, but they kept appealing and appealing and appealing, which made the process longer, which would mean more anxiety, more stress, more pressure, because it's like you finally won, but they won't give up for something that's just a basic human right. So I think making the process shorter, or finding a way to try and make it shorter, would definitely help a lot. Make them aware. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela. It's a very good point. It does seriously affect people whose rights have been violated when these procedures take so long. Thank you for that. And Liesl, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, thank you. We will do all we can, Daniela. We will. I think there are two things that I'd like to add to what Daniela said. Is that I think we really need to work on awareness, and that will have to include the children who are affected and their parents, and including telling people stories, which I think has been most successful in changing people's minds on the issue. And then the second thing I think is just to keep reminding people and ourselves that we are dealing with children's rights. And so we cannot approach it from this issue from an immigration or a state security point of view. And that we must keep bringing the focus back to a child's rights approach, and that the child firstly is entitled to certain things. And then if the state or whoever else is involved wants to object to that, a certain amount of rights must be in place until something is proven otherwise. So we must think about that, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Liesl. And Nicholas?
Yes, thank you. Positive development, I think, of course, the entry into force of our last convention. It's a modern convention, a modern instrument, and I think that we have some good signals about the interest of different states, but also of international organizations or international associations. The importance of the questions of civil status in general, and of course the rights of children is now, I think, clearly understood by most of the actors. They know that they have to do things to create new rights, and of course to use the international conventions that already exist.
Thanks, Nicholas. I hope that many, many more states will sign on to Convention 34, but also the other ones, of course. And Benoit.
Thanks for this last word, Mia. I would like to just highlight some positive result of individual complaints. So we have had to deal with many complaints coming from the same country. It was Spain, dealing with the same issue that was concerning the age assessment. So we had really to go in depth in those situations and to make a lot of recommendations to the state of Spain. Also to encourage them to improve the global approach of an accompanied minor and age assessment. And at the end of all those decisions, we can see that there was changes in the policy of Spain. So they have had a lot of internal discussion and they adopted new approach in this. And so this is an example for other countries that would like to follow this, good approach. And so that means that on the one hand, don't hesitate to bring case to the Committee on the Right of the Child under the OPIC, individual complaint mechanism. But of course, since not so many states have ratified the OPIC, we need more states to ratify the OPIC and to allow children to have access to remedies. If a state wants to take children's rights seriously, they need to ratify OPIC. Otherwise, it means you give rights to children, but you don't give them the possibility to challenge the situation where their rights haven't been fully implemented. And so I think that, as Daniela was also saying, the testimony of children and also the fact that we now understand how bad it is on the mental health and the enjoyment of all children's rights, we need to have more voices like Daniela's, on the one hand to denounce the problem, but also to show that when there is a solution, this goes in the direction of a better implementation of children's rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Benoit. Thank you, panelists. A fantastic last session to end this day. I think that overall this event has shown the importance of identity rights, the need to continue to promote awareness about the effects of not having an identity on so many millions of people in so many areas, that we can't forget them because they're not on our news, but they are suffering. We've heard the testimonies of Ferle, Daniela, and the Ukrainian children through their drawings. We can see the harm that it's doing, not only to their physical development, but also, as Daniela has said, is mental health issues. And we also heard from a number of different presentations from UNICEF, UNHCR, and the civil society actors, the importance of working together with the community, with people with lived experience, also twinning different services to make sure that people can go to the one-stop shop to establish their legal identity. But we've also heard that there is a lot of work left for us to do on behalf of child identity protection, and I'm sure Institute on Statelessness Inclusion. We look forward to working with you all to make sure that identity rights of children are better preserved and re-established quickly, like the convention says. And so I leave it to Denisha to close. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mia. And just also to say to all of our panelists, including the ones from previous sessions who are still with us, thank you so much for participating in this event. I think everyone will agree it was a really extremely interesting and engaging event. I know that we have some of the feedback has been, it would have been nice to have more opportunity to engage with the panelists. And so we do take that on board and we'll keep it in mind for our future webinars and other events, but also just to say that this is, again, hopefully just the first in a series of different types of events we may be doing on this topic. So I'd like to thank everybody. Was there a hand from you, Mia? No? Okay. So with that, I would like to close this symposium, and I wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for your participation.